Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. With Trump tearing through things like DEI and affirmative action with his own executive orders and a general turning away from many of these ideologies, especially by the right, it seems like they might have been defeated. It seems like the era of wokeness might at the very least have a recession. And so many people are asking, what replaces this? What is the proper system that we should be going back to? And the default answer seems to be a meritocracy, which sounds really good, but is this actually an alternative to DEI? Does this really change the way that we look at things, or is there more of an overlap between DEI and meritocracy than might first appear? My guest today is somebody who wrote a great piece on this previously. He is the CEO of New Founding. He's an investor and entrepreneur. Nate Fischer, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we dive into your piece, many people might not be familiar with the background or what you do, New Founding, those kind of things. Could you let people know what your projects are, what you're working on?
Sure. So in many ways, my work centers on solving problems like this. As you mentioned, the question becomes, what's next? Trump's getting rid of he's really stripping away a lot of the sort of vestiges of the old order. What replaces that? I think that's a question. It's a question for political thinkers, for philosophers, whatever, to answer. But it's also a question for entrepreneurs to answer. And so what New Founding is a venture firm that historically we've described as a venture firm for the American right. And that was something that we embraced when it was really a dissident position. We were maybe the only venture firm that was openly focused on the right. Obviously, the winds have moved. And the question is now, what is the right? And it's been a multi-year process of exploring what defines that, what should be the ideals that define that. But really, we invest in companies that achieve outcomes that are consistent with a right-aligned vision for the country. And really across a range of spaces, everything from an ad network in the firearms space to a pro-life health insurance company to alternative content for kids. And then we have a real estate division where we're actually building communities built around an aligned set of values. Increasingly who your neighbors are matters deeply to people, really that sense of community. And then we'll explore and delve into specific business opportunities that strategically align with what I would say are critical civilizational problems. So you look at the problems, and I think you'll see a lot of venture firms solving, say, national defense or American reindustrialization. People like to address those. We use the word civilizational for a reason, because what I would say is our lens is particularly attuned to our civilization, to what civilization means. It's more than just our economy. It's more than just our national security. It includes our culture. It includes our people. It includes the American tradition. And so what are problems that we can identify and opportunities, really for-profit business opportunities that we can identify looking through that civilizational lens? And then there's sort of alongside that, I have a nonprofit called American Reformer, which is focused on reforming the church and revitalizing a Christian answer to some of those questions. So ultimately complementing that question of where should we go from a venture perspective, it's really where should we go from a moral and from a Christian perspective. So I'm involved in both sides of that question, but really day to day, I like to say a startup envisions a future that doesn't exist and then wills it into existence. And the question then becomes, what future do we want? So it directly ties into questions like this one around meritocracy today.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because a lot of people, I'm fond of saying America is not just an economic zone, which is true, but that doesn't mean that America doesn't flourish as an economy when it's working for the good of its people, when it's aligned with a vision that is, unified over kind of a moral understanding. These things can win together. These things are holistic and, in fact, often really rely on each other. And so rather than breaking each part of our civilization into constituent parts and trying to maximize them individually, weaving them back together into a whole where we can all thrive across many domains, I think is an approach that is really critical to the right. So I'm very glad that you're doing the work that you're doing, and other people in the space are also considering these questions in a more holistic way. I want to get to your piece itself and the question of meritocracy, but before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. How far will a teacher go to save a kid on the brink of losing everything? From Angel Studios, the studio behind Sound of Freedom, comes Brave the Darkness, an inspiring true story about a troubled teen struggling to survive in a world that lets him down. Haunted by torturous childhood memories, Nate Williams finds himself engulfed in darkness. When his drama teacher, Mr. Dean, bails him out of jail and takes him in, Nate must confront his past before it leads him to his own destruction. Brave the Darkness reminds us that one meaningful connection can change everything. This powerful film will leave you uplifted and inspires as it shows the strength of compassion and the impact of never giving up on someone. I encourage you to see Brave the Dark in theaters now. Get your tickets today at angel.com/Auron. That's angel.com/Auron. All right, so like we were saying, the Trump administration is coming fast and hard at a lot of these liberal ideological standards that have been placed on everything in our society, removing the shackles that a lot of people have had to work through this entire time. And many people are saying, well, obviously we're getting rid of DEI. What was there before this? Oh, well, it was meritocracy, and we're returning back to meritocracy. And that's a great thing, right? Because ultimately meritocracy is about selecting the right people for the job. And I want to say at the outset, because a lot of people will just look at the title or get a little bit into this and say, well, why are you against merit? Obviously, we want merit. We want a doctor who can do surgeries. We want a scientist who is capable of solving the problem. I would like to make it clear at the beginning that we are not going to be against merit in this discussion. Merit is a critical factor that's going to play into the decisions. But the piece that you wrote was describing why meritocracy is something different and is more itself a system like DEI that reduces people to constituent parts. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I think that it's helpful to think about the word meritocracy, and in a sense, at the broadest sense, you can argue against it, but it's almost tautological, right? It's like we should have a meritocracy. We should have a country that is ruled by the people who merit rule, is like saying we should have a just regime. Of course you should have a just regime, but what does justice mean? So there's no point in arguing against the broad definition, but I also say the broad definition doesn't actually say much. Really, when people say they want a meritocracy, they're usually implying some particular concept of merit that aligns with some sort of, I would say, sort of secular assessment, neutral secular assessment of capability. Like we should hire the person who has the best resume for this job. We should hire the person who scores the highest on these tests. Because that's the only definition of merit where that actually adds something distinct from other definitions. And I think that what they usually mean de facto is they mean we should rely on credentials, standards, some sort of neutral assessment that separates the assessment of that person's capability, their ability to perform in, let's call it, critical job functions from any sort of identity of the person, any sort of background of the person, any sort of relationship or culture of the person. And that's where I think what you're doing is you're actually, you're recognizing things that may be important for judging whether the person is qualified, and you're elevating them to an ideal. So what I like to say is qualification remains a very valid question. You absolutely want someone who is qualified for the job. Hiring someone who's unqualified for the job is foolish and self-destructive. But qualification is really usually a threshold that you pass. So there might be certain jobs where you really do want to prioritize above everything else their exceptional ability. If you're choosing a brain surgeon, you're usually going to want a brain surgeon who's probably the best possible person you can find for that. For most jobs, and particularly for earlier career jobs, for jobs where there's sort of a significant investment in the person as much as there is any sort of specific skill, there's a huge range of factors that go into what type of person you might choose there, as well as for jobs that involve an element of sort of governance or rule. I mean, remember, ocracy refers to rule by. Ultimately, people say meritocracy, and they usually think of that as hiring people into companies. But really what that means in many cases is that those companies are run, they're ruled, large segments of our society are ruled by people who meet this standard. And there's a lot of factors that go into the sort of people you want running the institutions that in turn shape your society that may go beyond simply certain types of, let's say, economic ability to maximize profits or whatever.
Yeah, one of the analogies that has been used very regularly, including by Elon Musk when he was kind of having his H-1B debate, was America as a sports team, right? And the idea with America as a sports team is, of course, I want all the best players in every position because that makes sense. I'm going to win with all the best players. I want to pull someone, and if I need to pull someone from Africa and somebody from Europe and someone from Asia and somebody from South America, that's fine because ultimately I'm assembling the dream team. And of course, they're going to perform better than everybody else. But actually, just serendipitously, there was an article over at the Old Glory Club here today about meritocracy. And the author made a great point, which was if you look at sports teams, all-star teams are usually not that great, actually. They don't work the best together because there's something beyond just raw ability when you do this. Everyone famously points to Moneyball when it comes to kind of baseball and the turning the whole sport into a spreadsheet and statistics and the way that it maximizes everything. But something is lost there. There's a connective tissue that is more important than simply arranging statistics properly to generate the result that you're looking for. And so even if you're looking at this metaphor as America as a sports team, if you optimize it in the way that many people would like, yes, in theory, you are arranging people due to merit, but you lose a little bit of a secret sauce that doesn't always exist if you are just pulling everyone based off these kind of abstract, theoretically quantifiable values.
I think that's true. And that's true multiple aspects of a sports team too, right? It's true in that it can actually impede the performance itself and the competitiveness. But second of all, why do you watch sports in the first place? What makes a sports franchise appealing? An element of it is it's tied to the fans, the idea of homegrown heroes, the idea of people who remain. I think the more the sports team turns into a pure market where people are moving all the time, the more it loses what would actually make people care about a team, have any sort of loyalty. I mean, the example of the Olympics, I think, is a great example where you don't want the US to just have all the best people in the world. You watch the Olympics precisely because you want to root for your country and you want your country and people who are your countrymen to be competing. And yes, you want to build a culture where you have people who excel. You want to win at that. But ultimately, you also want it to be your people who are doing it. So I think that that's a great example. But I would say there's actually one more thing that's missed there, which is sports is a very definite set of rules. Sports ultimately is, in some sense, zero-sum competition. Some people win, some people lose. It's a game that is a very structured game. The Moneyball approach actually works better, although I would say the Moneyball approach works best when it's a little bit of an arbitrage, when not everyone's doing it. Once everyone's doing it, you actually lose a lot of the edge. But that's not life. Life is not ultimately a zero-sum game where we just compete with everyone else to try to win. Ultimately, we're trying to build successful businesses. Successful businesses, as Thiel has emphasized, have a monopoly of some sort. They're not actually just trying to sort of compete in a defined rule set competition where you're on a level playing field with everyone else. They want to build something that's exceptional, which could be an exceptional culture. It could be that it serves a particular community distinctly, not that it's actually just the best in some sort of measurable sense. You want to build a group of companies. When you build a country, ultimately, there's a group of companies. There's sort of a broader set of institutions that are trying to elevate your quality of life. They're not trying to win on some sort of global competitive landscape as their ultimate purpose. Their purpose is actually to provide good incomes for the people who work for them, to provide good services for the people who live there, to help ensure that that country can actually maintain a degree of sovereignty and independence. Those are all purposes that may relate to winning certain types of global competitions, but winning the competition is not the end goal. The end goal is actually elevation on that broad range of factors. So I think that one thing people mistake, Musk in particular, is they're easily analogizing to a sort of zero-sum competition rather than thinking of the purpose of these institutions in the first place.
Yeah, you regularly see guys like Vivek and Elon use the phrase "America needs to win," but never the question of win at what and win for whom, right? Like, what is the purpose of this winning? Who is actually winning in this scenario? Like you said, a lot of what used to give sports its draw was the fact that it was representing a specific area, a specific region. There was an identity attached to this. The reason that many people root for a local college football team, even though they never even went to the college, was that it reflected their community, the people that they knew and grew up with, had a chance to be elevated through this organization, then that's what gave it its identity. Once you start creating this highly mercenary scenario, this is one of the biggest complaints everyone has with sports today. Yeah, technically the football teams are better, great, but you don't feel any connection to them. They'll sell you out in a minute. They'll move to a different city the minute they think there's any more money, and the fans are just left. Like, you don't want a nation that is governed this way. That's not actually how, because it doesn't take in, as you say, the holistic well-being of the culture and the people. It's only looking at winning for a very narrow set of people. And yes, maybe you will be represented somewhere in that winning, but ask how representation is going for places like the Black community. Ultimately, that is not a real understanding of victory for a community. It's a more holistic understanding that we are elevating the standard of living, the moral vision, the sense of meaning, the well-being of families, and everything else collectively, because this understanding is the goal, not just, well, we have a few elite people and they are victorious over another set of elite people who are assembled somewhere else, and therefore we as a country are somehow winning.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I actually think that what they often end up missing is when you focus on winning of these short-term games, like a sports game, it often also tends toward a short-term optimum rather than a long-term optimum, even if your goal is excellent performance, even if your goal is let's say, GDP per capita and things, in the sense that my alternative to this, and to really put out sort of the direction I think we need to go, is not a reduction, is not a significant deprecation of qualification, is not a significant deprecation of exceptional performance. I think our country was exceptional has historically been exceptional at those things. There's no reason we can't continue to excel by those standards, even if we have a model that's something different than this sort of global marketplace model. But ultimately, I think done right, we end up something that's a far more robust system and actually a more dynamic system. So this kind of gets into this would get into the argument I would make for if I'm talking to people who, let's say, don't necessarily value these traditional conservative things. If maybe they're open to them, but that's not what their focus is. I would actually argue that there's more value. So the alternative that I focused on is ownership. Ownership and agency really are two of the ones I focus on. Really, the sort of third interlocking theme is community. Ownership, agency, and community are three dynamics that really shape how we think about things at New Founding. And they also they focus on dynamics that tend to produce exceptional output, particularly when you have exceptional people involved. They don't need to be the best people at something, but if you have a class of capable, motivated people, and you focus on responsive, basically, let's say in terms of who should rule. Well, I think owners should be the ones who have a presumed legitimacy in how they rule. If you have a family business, you own that business. You have a presumed legitimacy in who you decide to give the job to, whether it be the person with the best resume from the other side of the world, or let's just say, getting rid of immigration, the person with the best resume from the top state university who still has no ties to that particular business, or you give it to your son, or you give it to someone who's the son of the friend of someone you know in church who you're willing to bet on because you think that guy's, you just think that family has good character and that's someone who will display loyalty. Kind of whichever decision you go, whichever direction you go, there should be a presumed legitimacy that the owner, who ultimately has skin in the game around the success of that enterprise, is making a legitimate decision. Nepotism, the idea that nepotism became a dirty word, that was treated as something that's inappropriate, sort of presumptively illegitimate, you need to defend it, itself, I think, is one of the strongest reflections of this idea of meritocracy. People would commonly contrast nepotism with meritocracy. I would say that sullying of nepotism, that denigration of nepotism, is a fundamentally anti-conservative principle. Ultimately, the idea that if you own a business, you want it to go on to your kids, you want it to go on to other people in the community. Very, very conservative principle. It's also a principle that probably does far more to actually preserve the likelihood that that company manages certain risks and avoids, let's say, sort of chasing trends in the financial markets or whatever. If you have that long-term durable mindset to it, private equity might ostensibly be a little bit more efficient if they buy it and they bring in sort of optimal managers, but they also are very likely to to turn it into something that actually looks a lot more like every other company out there and ends up competing more with other companies. And there's a much better chance that it doesn't exist in 20 years if you have groups like that involved as well. So there's a sort of preservation. There's a long-term preservation of the institution and preservation of something that actually has a lot of optionality in terms of value down the road if you focus on things other than those short-term optimums.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to break down in there. So I guess let's start with the one that stood out me the most in your piece was this point about nepotism, right? Like this gets the worst rap, and understandably, you can look through history and see the mistakes of sometimes putting an unworthy child in a position of importance. Everybody wishes Marcus Aurelius hadn't chosen Commodus, right? Like there are many famous examples of this, but in general, understanding loyalty and bonds is much more important than necessarily always selecting the guy who's like 0.5% more optimal for any given position. And one of the things that kind of giving a nepotism a bad name does is ultimately it's a way to kind of tear apart familial and community bonds, right? Well, no, yes, my instinct should be to care for my family first and my neighbor, my church, my community, people like me, people who share my values, people who share my culture and my traditions. However, really, this system, and that's ultimately what we're talking about here, is like the rule of the system of meritocracy tells me that all of those things are immoral to consider. They are all suboptimal to consider, and sadly, optimal and moral are the same thing in kind of this understanding. And so therefore, I should tear up all those natural bonds. Why give this to my children? Why pass this on to my posterity when ultimately what I'm looking for is system optimization, and therefore I should be making my decisions across kind of those domains. And so you really end up in this scenario where the idea of just meritocracy, again, not discarding merit. Of course, you need capability and merit, but rather than saying, well, I need to cultivate that, I need to make sure that the people who are important to my life possess those qualities. Instead, you select for those qualities separate from your actual connections, your actual community. And this is what creates a scenario where ultimately Elon is like, America wins if we ship in 80,000 engineers from a foreign country, right? Because that doesn't seem like any kind of contradiction to him, because there's no connection between the idea that he has some kind of duty to pass this on to people who are directly connected to it and the victory of the system itself.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key point you get is really, this is a dynamic system. If you have a bias toward your community, if you have a bias toward your family, you have that much stronger of an incentive to make sure that those people actually get the skills needed. I think there's a very popular mentality even in America, where you sort of throw your kid out of the house at 18 and he's on his own, and he can sort of find his way in the marketplace. It's not surprising that people who have that mindset end up getting to the point that they're 70 years old and they don't have anyone to take over their family business. And in many cases, it turns out there's not really anyone interested in moving to that town and taking that business. I mean, if you think about it, it's a much less appealing job ultimately to move to a sort of smaller city or something if you don't have any ties there and taking over a moderate sized business. Cultivating a class of people internally who both have a loyalty to that community, have a vested interest in it, and you've actually developed with the capabilities to run that kind of thing, is actually a much better long-term move even for that town. And ultimately, it's a much better move for this country. I think you see a very, very common theme where you have people who do not prioritize the cultivation of discipline in Americans. And it's interesting. Vivek actually talked about this. He doesn't like how we raise kids. He doesn't like our values, but he wants to bring in a bunch of immigrants. And there's actually, in many ways, bringing in immigrants can become a cope for failures to actually invest in our own citizens and failures to create a culture that cultivates those virtues in our citizens. And I would say, I'm with him. We need to do a much better job cultivating virtues in the American populace. But there's a very American way of doing that. There have traditionally been there have been American cultural attributes that have been elevated and have largely been allowed to fall. And they've been allowed to fall partially because of largely left-wing ideologies that sort of treat it as virtuous, let's say, not to discipline people in school. So you end up with a bunch of people who never grow up with discipline. They go into drugs, they go into crime. And what do? You replace them with the more meritorious immigrants who are willing to work hard. And now you get virtue points both sort of in the first batch because you didn't discipline these people because you recognize their hard background or whatever. And you get virtue points over again when you let these poor refugees come into the country and work hard and better their lives. And in both cases, is actually just the product of a failure of courage and a failure of willingness to actually do the hard work of investing in your own citizens. I think that applies at the top level too, where you actually, the same managerial mindset that celebrates meritocracy is also the one that encourages you to send your kid away to some other university, let's say, and sort of major in whatever his heart desires, rather than raising him to take over a family legacy and have something. And ultimately, he just turns into sort of another guy competing in this sort of broad sea of people, whether it's the arts, whether it's writing, whether it's law, sort of an undifferentiated mass of professionals, rather than, again, building on a legacy where family ties can be developed, where loyalty can be developed, ultimately where trust can be built. And this is why I think this is such a self-destructive mindset, is we're seeing a broad decline in societal trust. In a world where societal trust declines, trust will be one of the scarcest resources. It'll be one of the most valuable resources. And when you have longstanding ties in a community, the time involved in building those is something that cannot be replaced. There's a skin in the game associated with those ties that ultimately there's no substitute for that when it comes to the creation of trust. And those communities potentially have trust-based relationships that can be incredibly valuable, that can both allow, let's say, their companies to thrive. They can allow things like access to credit in a world where that sort of personal relationship is scarce. Ultimately can be the basis of customer relationships, ultimately are something that becomes incredibly scarce and is different from, but complementary to, the sort of qualifications that are often considered in merit, and devalued by a managerial society where essentially the only sort of trust-based model or trust-based credential that matters are those sort of general universal sort of university credentials that go on your resume. So again, what you're doing is you're sort of flattening the world by stripping people out of these environments where they can build something that actually increasingly, I think, will prove more valuable. So I would say this sort of, what I like to say is this is it's certainly an argument popular with GDP maximalists, but it's actually a self-defeating argument, even if your goal is GDP maximizing, because sort of unsurprisingly, I think, for anyone who understands the sort of conservative viewpoint, they're actually destroying things that have value in a sort of longer time horizon, actually have a lot of value that often are not appreciated.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the piece is you address managerialism several times, and one of the points that you make is that DEI and meritocracy are ultimately both relying on a certain form of managerial mindset, which is people are simply kind of these values on a spreadsheet, whether it be their racial and sexual characteristics, because diversity is our strength, or, number of degrees and credentials and these kind of things, because, the credentials are our strength. Either way, they're flattening people, as you say. They're selecting for only that criteria rather than understanding that most of our social organization is far more complex than we grasp. Everyone from Polybius to Aristotle to, Gaetano Mosca recognized that the mixed constitution is the best type of government because different social forces bring different criteria for selection into them. And any one selection for criteria tends to corrupt the whole. But if you have multiple selection criteria for the different sorts of elites and power structures that are involved in your ruling class and your elite, that's actually going to strengthen things rather than weaken them, because you're not going to have this kind of really thin ideological selection process that ignores everything else. And like you said, a lot of the GDP maximizers are like, well, if we just get enough, guys with X IQ or credential into the slot, then we win. But what they're kind of counting on is that social fabric, those connections, that tradition and culture that was already there. And they're just saying, well, if we can drive the other numbers up on top of that, then we will win. We'll outcompete everybody else. But as you're pointing out, if you maximize for that one thing, if you maximize for that one selection criteria, and you don't understand that you are wearing away all of those foundations on which you were stacking it, then inevitably when it comes apart, yes, in theory you could have outperformed, but in reality, you're going to do much worse because you got a lot of highly credentialed or IQ people who have no way to trust each other, interact with each other, build systems together, unify a vision together. And so therefore they just come apart. And so that's why, you're saying, the robustness versus necessarily optimization, right? We can get very, 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 very good at one thing, but the minute a storm comes by and blows that really thin thing over, we just collapse because there's no resilience built into the system, as where something that is more organic, has more of a network effect, understands those connections in a more real way, it's going to be much stronger in general, even if it's not as competitive in one specific area.
Absolutely. And I think a great example that has become much more visible over the past year. So I wrote this piece a year ago, and I focused on this idea of going back to sort of elaborate on this idea of DEI is just a manifestation of managerialism, just like meritocracy is. Both of them are something that really reduce organizations to spreadsheet models. And in meritocracy, you're sort of optimizing for one view of the world. DEI, you're sort of assuming, well, we can tweak these inputs, and we can sort of re-engineer it in a way that ultimately corrects for these market inefficiencies or these biases or whatever. And both of them have this engineering mindset of the world. And in both of these, you as a worker in the system are just an interchangeable cog, or the more you're an interchangeable cog, the more conveniently you're actually going to fit into these organizations. So a great example is large multinational corporations. They try to, let's say they try to be meritocracies. Let's take that for granted. Well, DEI is still useful because they're meritocracies that want to be able to run the same operation effectively, whether it's in Thailand or whether it's in the US or whether it's in Sao Paulo. And so the more the people who are the inputs into those systems are interchangeable, the more potentially they even sort of can get on a plane and move from one to the other sort of at moment's notice as the sort of spreadsheet model says you need more resources over here. The better you fit into this model, the more you're sort of the more the sort of meritocratic metrics become the pure descriptors of the person. And I think what's relevant here is AI has massively developed in the last year, just as an example of sort of dynamic resilience. The more you as a person can be reduced to a few cells on a spreadsheet that describe you and describe your job, guess what can do that even better than you? An algorithm. So you're going to be replaced by an algorithm. Now, you might say that's actually very convenient for the organization you work for. It's nice for a company to build a meritocracy where they can then gain even more efficiencies by replacing people with algorithms. But if that's the entire way you run your organization, you're also going to be competing with a bunch of other companies that also run those same algorithms. So you're going to have nothing that actually makes this organization durable or differentiated. If you actually understand people as people, understand, for instance, how they complement algorithms, there's always going to be a sort of spreadsheet component of the business. There's going to be that sort of process and that sort of numbers and that sort of analytical component of the business. But the more you understand your people as people and you focus on their distinctly human traits, whether that be relationships, whether that be communal ties, whether that be the way they have sort of creativity in ways that fall outside of really probably things that would be measurable even on a resume or measurable in a sort of head-to-head analysis in a pure meritocracy, the more you actually have something that is valuable and distinguishing at an organization level that will actually be complementary to growth in technology like AI. So if you have those sort of truly human attributes of your organization, really as the centerpiece of the organization, you now are positioned to sort of lever more and more valuable technology very, very quickly because you understand the part that's not changing. The technology is changing very quickly. If you've reduced the human side to essentially a bunch of de facto human algorithms, yes, you can sort of substitute algorithms for those people, but someone else can substitute an algorithm for your entire business.
Right. Well, and really that's what we're talking about at the end of the day, right? Managerialism is itself the attempt to replace human judgment with systems, right? I don't want to make an evaluation on every individual that walks in my door. There's a lot of responsibility for that. So if I have the ability to point to their credentials, point to the number of points that they've accumulated in the spreadsheet, then if they fail, if they did something wrong, it's not that my selection criteria was bad. It's not that my judgment was bad. It was the system. The system is what chose them, and if they fail, then it's the system's responsibility for selecting them, or something was wrong there. And what you're really advocating for, whether it's returning to an understanding of nepotism as the negative conversation, but really loyalty to one's community, family, social bonds, or whether it be, looking at a wider variety of evaluation, what you're really saying is we have to get back to a place where we are no longer reliant on abstract systems, be it DEI or meritocracy, but we are taking responsibility at an individual level for the choices that we make. Leadership, real human leadership, means evaluating people across many different domains and taking responsibility for their success or failure, investing in them as people and your community as something valuable, rather than using it as some kind of tax farm or talent farm that you can draw on to create larger bureaucracies or institutions.
Absolutely, and I think that is really the key differential, right? Are we looking at this in a holistic sense? And I think you can apply that economically, where you say there's really an understanding of economic value. I mean, what I just made is an argument that you as a CEO running your company purely focused on what makes you competitive 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, what makes you survive and maintain your durable ability to generate profits should be considered. You don't even have to care about the human aspect in and of itself for that argument to be valid. But at the same time, there's also the sort of horizontal of what do people actually value? What is the purpose here? What is the goal that we're optimizing for, if we're optimizing for anything? I think as a general rule, optimizing itself is a word that should make us suspicious, because I think anytime you're optimizing for something, you're often flattening out other things that are good, often actually good on a dynamic basis, even for the thing that you're supposedly optimizing for. And so in many ways, I think managerialism focuses on optimizing, whereas human systems often will focus on sort of achieving goods in a more holistic sense.
So one of the issues that we have to address, and it's my hobby horse, so I've got to mention it every time. While we are bagging on managerialism and one of its descendants here, in the form of meritocracy, ultimately these systems weren't adapted without a reason, right? Like, scale is a problem. When you want to evaluate people holistically, you need to understand them. You need to understand their community. You need to understand their value set. You probably need to share many of those things to truly evaluate them across the board. One of the reasons that we got managerialism was so that we could massify. One of the reasons we got meritocracy was so that we could quickly evaluate someone we've never met, that we have no connection to. Yeah, they just got off the plane from the entirely different part of the country, or they literally got off a boat from a different country entirely across a different continent. And we want to be able to look at them and immediately evaluate, are you good for this? Can I slot you right into this system and keep on running? The downside of that is all the things that we have just listed. But to be fair, there are upsides, right? This does create many of the advantages of scale and efficiency that we have seen in our current world today. Now, I would argue, and have argued, that we are reaching the end of those goods, right? Like we are getting a return on the margin and utility of optimizing for those traits. However, they are still there, and we will lose some level of that if we decide to go with a different system, right?
So I think this is a question that is actually hard. It's a very, very high stakes question. Obviously, it's one that I've discussed before with mutual friends of ours. And I don't know, I guess, is the point. We certainly lose. Managerialism is certainly convenient if you are trying to manage a global organization. Absolutely. Whether the global organization even remains the most effective way at generating the goods that people care about at scale is another question. Uh, ultimately, ultimately, a key to generating wealth is actually knowledge more than anything else. And knowledge can be copied and knowledge can be scaled without an organization necessarily scaling with it. So the example I give, and as I use a sort of alternative to managerialism, let's say you're trying to sort of replicate something across the entire country. You can have the managerial approach where you have processes in place. You sort of reduce the person's job description to as much of a sort of a set of boundaries and a set of rules as possible, a set of standards. You have middle managers monitoring them, or you have an ownership-based model. You have a bunch of companies around the country owned by people who ultimately have the accountability and the responsibility that comes from ownership, all trying to deliver those. And they're still competing with each other. They're not pure monopolies. Ultimately, they're there. And if they make missteps, if their kid is a total loser and they give the business to their kid, then business probably declines and someone else buys it or someone else takes market share. But that itself actually incentivizes sort of very case-by-case discussions. I mean, there's a great example talking about meritocracy, about the limits. You certainly don't, let's say your daughter is getting married. It's certainly not a pure meritocracy where it's just an audition and sort of the person with the best resume gets it and there's a set of things. But if you have a business, historically, it might have been a significant consideration that you actually want her to marry the sort of person who could come in and take over your business for you. That's historically been a very, very strong consideration for people like that. So there's all sorts of decentralized ways people will try to, in a distributed fashion, try to sort of mix those human factors with things like qualification that are relevant for the preservation of this. And that in itself is an alternative to managerialism. That in itself is a situation that's a far more complex and far more personal or familial type of situation than anything that a managerial org can possibly achieve. And yet, if you have sort of a patchwork of, let's say, hundreds of these businesses delivering the same thing, that may end up being a more robust system. And then you say, well, they can't achieve the economies of scale that the big company can. Possibly not. In some cases, the economies of scale do actually highly benefit, let's say, a highly centralized operation. You're not going to produce the Starship through a patchwork of sort of thousands of companies. There's going to be one company that can do that. But in many cases, ultimately, the innovations are primarily knowledge-based innovations, which then could be replicated. They could potentially be sold. The IP can be preserved, and maybe it's encoded in some software that's sold to these other companies. But the companies in a distributed fashion can become nearly as efficient or even more efficient in some cases. Let's say they're as efficient at certain dynamics and they're better on others because you have better ultimately skin in the game and responsibility at the ownership level than anything you could achieve through any sort of management incentive or process. I think the franchise system actually approaches this, where in many ways the franchise system ultimately is a ownership-based system. And yes, there's lots of rules and franchise manuals in different cases, but in many cases, what they're doing is they're replacing a whole lot of management controls with something that is much more centered on ownership and recognizing ultimately an owner is going to handle and be responsible for all sorts of things that you could never manage through a managerial model. You could never ultimately come up with a sort of classic meritocratic way of judging people as well as just the reality of owning this business will. And so I don't know that you even need to lose many of the benefits that people think of. I think in some cases you will, in some cases you won't. In some cases you'll be offset by something that's actually better even in the short term. In other cases you'll be offset by something that's better in potentially intangible dimensions, more dynamic long-term dimensions. But I'm not convinced that this is necessarily something that requires even significant material sacrifices.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about the long-term implications. I think that long-term, the current paradigm is failing. We can see that all around. And so even if there was some level of short-term sacrifice, and like you said, that may or may not be the case, ultimately, if you have the vision, if you're focused on the future of a community of people, of a tradition that you actually care about, then that long-term survivability and robust nature is far more important than kind of the short-term maximization. Again, if that even is a trade-off that you have to pay. But in a little bit of a pivot, since I have a right-wing focused businessman on, I have to ask you a question that is always burning for me, which is we look at the left and they seem to understand long-term. Of course, many leftist businessmen want to make money, that kind of thing, but they seem to understand at some level. They wouldn't call it a noblesse oblige because they don't quite have that understanding, but they understand that investing in culture, investing in institutions that don't immediately turn a profit is both good morally, but also importantly, actually critical to their long-term success. If you own the culture, if you own the system, if you own many of these critical institutions, education and such across your civilization, then you may not see the immediate 5-year return on that investment, but long term you will be making much more money, be more powerful, and if you have the right culture that you built, be much healthier. You'll raise the standard of living and everything else of the people that you're kind of serving. That seems to be something the left understands. Though, I often hear someone say, "Oh, well, how are these leftist news organizations operating? They don't have any subscribers. They don't make any money." It's like, well, yeah, because the leftist businessmen who operate them usually just see them as some kind, they're a patron more than they are an owner in many scenarios. We're seeing a little less of that now because they've become so radically unprofitable. But in many other domains, they will make these investments. And yet, when you bring this to many right-wing businessmen, it's just like, okay, but like, how do I make money in this in 6 months? Like, how does this turn a profit for me immediately? Sure, maybe I could fund a proper redo of Shakespeare that's true to it, that strips out any of these stupid DEI elements of there, and I could actually perpetuate, this tradition, can carry on the English canon. But like, how do I make money off of that in 2 months? And that seems to be a mindset that really blinds a lot of what has been done. I know that's part of what you're trying to break out of, but why did we see that for so long on the right?
Well, so much of that I would say comes down to two factors. One is even the profit perspective is not necessarily informed by a long-term vision. So what you describe is true certainly of culture, but you also had this view that the right historically was very bad at even things like venture investing. And I would say many of those people have pivoted over to the right, but they're not necessarily sort of culturally on their right in their vision. That's actually a gap we're trying to fill. There's a lot of things where I actually believe there's an opportunity, and it's a massive opportunity, but you need to be able to sort of look at that often a 10-year J curve where you sort of recognize there's this investment, it takes time to pay off, and it may even be an incredibly profitable business. And I think that most conservatives, because of the sort of segments of the economy they've moved to, they're fine at understanding how to do that in real estate development or something. They know how to do that in certain categories, but they really don't know how to do that in categories like technology and venture. I would say there's an element to which they're often rightly suspicious of the sort of intangible claims about. I think a more conservative economy often is actually just going to value the tangible a little bit more in certain ways. I would say the broader one, though, is they're not averse to those sorts of things, but they do it in ways that I think are flawed. So they'll give money to their church all day long, and those churches are certainly doing things that are not profit-oriented. But in many ways, even the conservative churches have adopted a very anti-institutional mindset, a very sort of low church mindset, where our approach to what is a worthwhile investment is, are we, let's say, doing this mission project that will win 10 souls over the next year or whatever? That's a very short-term mindset. Are we building the cathedral, right? Are we building an institution that will be a great institution in 50 years? Not something that's considered. And that, in many ways, that long-term mindset, I would say, due to sort of fairly complex sociological factors actually related to kind of how conservatives were able to preserve who remained a conservative, what types of people remained conservatives during a period of largely left-wing dominance of the institutions, probably encouraged conservatives to adopt a sort of anti-institutional mindset. Now, what I like about, in many ways, the Silicon Valley mindset is it's not necessarily an anti-institutional mindset, but it's one that is perfectly happy to sort of challenge and disrupt the institution. With your own project, it might take 20 years to achieve, to really achieve the kind of results you're envisioning. If you have that mindset, that Silicon Valley willingness to exit, but disrupt toward build something greater, rather than just sort of exit and sort of put your head down and try to avoid the institutional world because it's inherently corrupt. And you combine that with a right-aligned cultural landscape. So you're recognizing opportunities grounded in culture. They may be profitable opportunities. They may be opportunities for your nonprofit giving, similar to how you would give to your church. But if you recognize that, if you're looking at that perspective, if you're applying that lens, kind of coming from the outside, recognizing that we can build institutions that will challenge the incumbents, that mentality, I think, is largely missing. And that's a huge part of what I'm trying to solve, is really so much of it, I think, comes down to imagination. I was going to say this comes down even back to the question of meritocracy, to the question of whether the managerial model versus the distributed model ultimately yields higher returns. So much of it is the product of human creativity. If our sort of elite class has been catechized to believe that the managerial model is necessarily the most efficient one, all of their efforts and all of their innovation is going to go into improvements that fit that model. You're going to have software, you're going to have SaaS or whatever that's can be designed to make managerial organizations more efficient. You're going to have credentials designed to be sort of as universally recognized as possible. All of these creative efforts are going to go into that. To a large extent, I think and this is really one of the greatest opportunities I see, is the opportunity merely for imagination to recognize that there's potential, and often more potential, in another model. And sometimes it's as simple as spend an extra hour thinking, using your human creativity to think about a solution that actually gets you to the same place, but in a way that's building on concepts like ownership and responsibility rather than managerial systems. You could either, you could either tweak your managerial process to improve the metric you care about, or you can think about the ultimate purpose of that metric and come up with a tool that allows the independent businessman or whatever to get there as well. And then you can sell the tool to him and you have a business that way. And I think if society as a whole sort of presumes that the former model is where the opportunity is and where the path of history is going, that's where most people are going to default spend their time. If you realize that that's not the permanent model, and I would argue actually the macro trends are going against that managerialism or disrupting managerial institutions, you might spend that same hour of creativity on solving a problem that actually works for distributed communities. You're going to see a lot more. You're going to see a lot more solutions that work for those communities, work for those alternative non-managerial models. So that's why I'm so optimistic. I think at this point, I think there's massive amounts of low-hanging fruit focused on those problems. Just being willing to realize that if we believe in people, if we believe that this alternative is on the rise and the managerial model is on the decline or is facing growing disruption, there's going to be a lot of low-hanging opportunities to deploy what are often very new and very powerful technologies to serve these alternative models.
Nope, that makes sense. All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Nate, do you have time to answer a few questions from the audience?
I could do 3 or 4 minutes, Bryce. So
okay, great. All right, we're going to move over to the questions of the people. But before we do, is there anywhere that you want to direct people? Anything that you want them to check out?
So I post a lot on X at Nate A. Fischer. New Founding, my organization, has our website, newfounding.com, as well as our own X account. So that's really where we're active. We're very, very public with what we're doing, and we talk about it a lot.
Excellent. Well, we'll start doing the questions, and if you need to bail out because you got to go, just let me know, and I'll finish them up myself. All right, so JGJ says, critique of embracing nepotism, doesn't that lock in a individual to a specific class and role because your dad did this job seems caste-like?
So, yes, I think that at an extreme, if you believe that you're always going to hire your son for that and he inherits the role, that's the extreme. I think the version that our American founders accepted, and really the Anglo world has always, and going back to even the Roman world, right? They would adopt, Julius Caesar adopted right. Octavian, I believe, has always been a sort of fluid system where there's I would think of them as sort of biases rather than absolute rules. You have a sort of preference for hiring your son, and you can, if he's capable of putting the effort in, it's good. But there's going to be times where you're going to hire someone else, or using the sort of son-in-law example, you're bringing other people into the family even. Likewise, if your son is just really not interested in that, there's probably something else that he's going to see a return on. But if your default is to kick him out of the house and say, go to NYU and study whatever, and, don't have any sort of anchoring. I think that's the opposite extreme, and that's really where we've gotten, and that's resulted in lots of family businesses that don't have anyone to take them over, and in some cases, no one even capable of taking them over, and they're literally just shutting them down.
Yeah, again, the ability for humans to make decisions is key, right? We're not locking in entirely to meritocracy, but you're also not entirely locking into a caste system, because that lack of dynamic ability inside a caste system is also a problem. So again, the point being, keep those family ties, understand that is an important thing, but that doesn't become the only metric anymore. Then merit becomes the only metric if you're being wise. Michael Robertson says the creation of Moneyball should be considered a war crime. It's the ultimate lib think. Yeah, again, might work better in the short term in baseball, but doesn't really improve the quality of enjoyment, I think, overall when it comes to sports. William McDuffie, thank you very much for that donation. Very generous. He says, but he that is a hireling and not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. John 10:12. Yeah, once again, skin in the game, right? Ownership is key.
Absolutely. Non-substitutable. There's no possibility of hiring someone who has the same skin in the game.
Precisely.
Except the only real exception would be, let's say it's a hireling who has deep community ties to you, right? If the hireling is the son of one of your longtime family friends, and your family has a multi-generational relationship, you're starting to approach that. That's, again, not something that resembles meritocracy.
Precisely. JGJ says, not everyone can stomach being George Bailey. Perhaps, but that's what leadership looks like, right? Those are the people that you do want to elevate. You want the guy who can make the evaluation. You want my buddy Kevin Dolan had a great article on this, actually specifically about It's a Wonderful Life, talking about why George Bailey is loved. He has the ability to make the decision. He has the sovereignty to make the decision on behalf of the community. He's not just looking at the ones and zeros of it, but they trust him that ultimately he's still guiding them in the right direction because he has earned that trust from the community.
I would also say there's a lot of people who maybe didn't think they wanted to be George Bailey, and they went to New York and spent 5 years as an associate at a prestigious law firm and realized that, that path's not all it's cracked up to be either. So
yeah, very true. Very true. Norwegian Cross says, do you think AA won the bet, or is it the woke still out there? I'm still waiting for a good movie, but I'm not holding my breath. Yeah, again, I don't want to rehash this bet too often because it's already been declared over. But to be clear, the bet was that not that the woke was undefeatable, but that the ruling elites could not choose to put the woke away, that they would not be able to themselves to make that determination. That is not the same as the woke losing. It's not the same as the woke being defeated. So is woke on the retreat? Yes, it is. But was it on the retreat because all of the elites decided simultaneously we are intentionally going to end doing this? Or did it prove to be a failure, lose to somebody like Trump and his movement, and then end up getting, basically outlawed? And again, I'm still very doubtful that we don't have a long road ahead of kind of rooting this out. But ultimately, that was my point.
Well, and I would argue, jumping in, tying to the meritocracy, I think we have the political parties have become sort of the managerial regime versus managerial opponents, and everything from Silicon Valley to the original MAGA caucus. They're all opponents of the managerial regime. I don't think the managerial regime has given up or changed their mind on this. I think that we've just seen a crystallization of a group of people have a vested interest in displacing that.
Yeah, at some point I need to pick your brain on kind of the Silicon Valley managerial distinction and whether or not they're going to try to replace that with AI, but that's a whole nother can of worms.
That's a fun one that leads into questions of whether we see a return to monarchy. So
yeah, right. JGJ says franchise. It all goes back to the Panda Express. Yeah, that's right.
Hey, I'll point out, even at Panda Express, and I don't know if that's a franchise system or not, but there's a big difference between being an employed assistant manager and a career that leads to your ownership of a Panda Express. A lot of franchise owners have pretty good lives, but if you're just an employee there, I think that's a less glorious career path.
Yeah, again, the hope that ownership, if you're working 80 hours a week to own your own business, that's a much different thing as opposed to, managing another business for someone else who you will never acquire. You'll never pass it on to anybody. You'll never have real ownership over it. Jacob Zindel says, does the principal agent problem play into the meritocracy nepotism dichotomy? Is abandoning merit for familiar bonds worse if the executive is appointed by shareholders who don't share those bonds?
I think this is a massive question. This is why I would make the argument that in many cases, we need to actually, I think there's a real appreciation. I kind of came into this reading guys like Taleb and George Gilder, who I think do some really good evaluation of why, even from if you're thinking about a longer time horizon, even if it's sort of purely economic, it actually makes sense to consider approaches. The managerial approach, the McKinsey approach, is not necessarily the best one for sure. That idea that ultimately, if you can reduce everyone in your company to an algorithm, then someone else can replace your company with an algorithm. That applies even if you're thinking about the good of the company purely from a shareholder standpoint. But certainly, yes, the principal agent problem means that ultimately there's things the principal can do that an agent cannot do and should not be able to do and should not do. So this is why I think ownership tied to agency is actually really good. If you have a world where there are active, engaged owners of businesses, that is a world that is capable of maintaining far more richness than a world that tries to separate ownership from agency.
All right, and our last one here. Autism says prescript autonomy, virtuos. Sorry, can't pronounce that today. Virtuocracy, cardinal and theological for subordinal, restoration of subsidiary and solidarity, Catholic semiosis. I think you're just trying to do this to have fun with me. Innovation, Avalon W plus E of heaven and earth is his good time. I understood some of those words. Anything that you drew out of that, Nate?
It looks like themes, subsidiarity, solidarity. There's themes here that and that it looks like they're coming from a Catholic angle, but have analogs that would be very, very relevant to a lot of these considerations. So these are not new principles.
That was definitely a good try on that one. It was better than I would have done. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap this up, guys. Once again, thank you, Nate, for coming on. Everybody should check out New Founding and what they are doing over there. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. Click the bell and notification to make sure that you know when these streams go live. If you want to get the broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast network. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.